June 4th, 1942. 1440 hours. The Pacific stretched wide and blinding, a flat mirror broken only by the wounded silhouette of the USS Yorktown slicing through the sea. The sky above was deceptively calm, blue and endless. Then came the lookout's cry. Tiny black specks burst over the horizon, Nakajima B5N. Kates, flying low and fast, their engines shrieking through the light like furious saws. Within seconds, the carrier's anti-aircraft batteries erupted, turning the air into a storm of shrapnel and smoke so thick it reeked of burnt cordite and scalding oil. Chief Boatswain's mate Clifford W. Hope, 28, was already sprinting toward the mid-deck when the first torpedo slammed home. The blast hurled him against a bulkhead, driving the breath from his chest. The steel howled as though alive, the deck trembling beneath his boots. A wave of steam surged through the passageway, burning men where they stood. Hope dragged himself upright, ears ringing, vision swimming in a blur of gray smoke and orange flame. Somewhere below, the ship's heart was bleeding out. The intercom spat static and fragments of orders. "Flooding port side. Engine rooms hit. All damage control to stations." The Yorktown lurched to port, groaning as tons of seawater forced their way inside. Hope seized a fire hose, twisted the valve. Nothing. Power dead. Pumps silent. Overhead lights flickered once before dying completely, leaving the corridor bathed in the dull glow of fires licking through ruptured ducts. Around him, men coughed and shouted for help, their voices echoing eerily off the metal walls. In the hangar bay, bombs rolled free across the slanted deck. Aviation fuel spread beneath them, forming shimmering pools under the orange light. Hope vaulted over a broken pipe, the air so thick with metallic vapor it clawed at his throat, every breath scorched like embers. A sailor stumbled past, uniform in tatters, face ghost white. "Torpedo! Port quarter!" he gasped before collapsing. Hope didn't pause. His boots splashed through the rising mixture of oil and seawater that coated the floor like tar. He reached the port ladder just as another shock wave slammed the hull. The deck heaved and dropped like a drum skin. Somewhere aft, a boiler erupted, a hollow roar that rattled his teeth. Bits of plating rained down, clanging against catwalks. Hope threw up an arm to shield his head, stumbled forward, caught a railing. The tilt worsened. Everything loose began to slide toward the sea. Hoses, crates, men. The air outside was even worse. Smoke poured from the island superstructure in greasy ribbons that drifted across the sun. Planes burned where they stood, wings folding like dying birds. Hope wiped soot from his face, eyes streaming, throat raw. The noise of the ocean mingled with fire and chaos, a broken rhythm that made thought impossible. He could feel the deck quiver beneath him, as if the ship itself still fought to breathe. From below came a shout, "Flooding through the electrical trunk!" Hope turned and saw men vanishing into a hatch already half submerged in black water. Diesel fumes burned his nostrils. His hands trembled from heat and adrenaline. The Yorktown wasn't just damaged. She was drowning from the inside. He dropped beside the hatch, shouting for damage control. Pumps, hoses, anything that could move water. Only static answered from a dead radio. The heat pressed against his neck like a branding iron. Hope peered into the darkness below. Oily water rising fast, swallowing the ladder rung by rung. He knew then that the pumps were gone, the power dead, and the ocean was already inside. For a moment, time stood still. Every instinct screamed the ship was lost. The list was past 7 degrees and climbing. Bulkheads groaned, rivets snapped like rifle fire. The sea was winning. Hope clenched his jaw and descended anyway, boots sinking into the burning mix of oil and water. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes, turning the air into a choking fog. He pushed deeper, step after step, into the inferno. into the heart of a ship that still refused to die. Somewhere above, the klaxons wailed again, distant, sharp, echoing down the corridors. Hope's fists tightened as he listened to the hollow rumble of dead pumps and the tortured groan of twisting metal. He knew if the flooding wasn't stopped soon, the Yorktown would roll, taking more than 2,000 souls with her. He searched the shadows for anything. A hose, a valve, a miracle. Only black water crept higher around his knees, the roar of the Pacific pounding through the hull. The ship was dying by the minute, and he had no way to stop it. But Hope wasn't ready to let her go. Not yet. 3 weeks before Midway, the USS Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor like a battered giant returning from war. Her hull was torn open, her flight deck twisted and warped from the beating she'd taken at Coral Sea. Crewmen moved quietly across her decks, stepping over scorched scars, still black with soot. The shipyard commander had said she was weeks away from being seaworthy. Washington ordered her ready in 72 hours. Welders worked without pause, sparks raining like fire over patched steel. Fresh paint sealed cracks that hadn't truly closed. Every man aboard knew the ship was being sent back to sea, held together by little more than faith and exhaustion. When she sailed again, her boilers groaned as though protesting their burden. The bulkheads sweated with condensation, and every shudder ran through her bones. She wasn't a proud warship anymore, just a survivor forced into another fight. Hope knew it from the first uneven cough of the engines, their rhythm like a dying man's breath. The mechanics joked she was kept afloat by rust and habit alone, but no one found it funny for long. At Midway, she steamed beside Enterprise and Hornet, part of a formation cutting across an ocean that seemed endless. Yet everyone aboard could feel the unseen enemy drawing closer. Planes launched and landed, the deck vibrating beneath each catapult shot, the sharp scent of aviation fuel stinging the eyes. Below, Hope's crew tightened bolts, checked valves, replaced gaskets that failed again minutes later. The noise was relentless. Hammers on steel, water rushing through pipes, the deep pulse of engines running hotter than safety allowed. Then came the warning. Enemy torpedo bombers inbound. Battle stations. Hope felt the vibration change, deeper, faster, the sound of tension spreading through the hull. The gunners opened up first, tracers arcing red across the sky. But the attackers came in low, almost scraping the waves. Sirens wailed, bulkhead doors slammed, and the acrid stench of gunpowder filled the air. 2 torpedoes struck home. The first hit below the island. The second slammed into the port side near Boiler Room 5. Compartments flooded instantly. Pipes split apart, circuits blew, sparks showered down. Hope reached the lower deck moments before the lights went out. The emergency bulbs flickered red, casting everything in a dim, bloody glow. Damage control manuals lay open and useless. They called for electric pumps, sealed hatches, and radio coordination. All systems now dead. Hope grabbed one anyway, flipping through pages soaked with seawater. The diagrams meant nothing when the ocean itself was pushing through the seams. His team tried to start the auxiliary pumps, but seawater choked their engines. One motor shorted, another burned out. The only sound left was the relentless hiss of the rising flood. Messages crackled through the intercom, each one worse than before. Boiler rooms evacuated. Ammunition storage flooded. Forward generator lost. The Yorktown had no power, no pressure, no control. She was now just a drifting target wrapped in smoke. Captain Buckmaster's voice came through the static, steady but strained. "Contain flooding. Keep the list under 8 degrees. His orders reached compartments already underwater. Hope could see the tilt growing worse. He braced himself against the wall, watching a wrench slide slowly across the deck and vanish into black water. The hull groaned as if trying to breathe. Men stumbled as the slant steepened, their boots scraping against oil-slick steel. Someone shouted that the port passage was sealed, blocked by fire and wreckage. Hope sent 2 men to check the watertight door, but it was jammed tight, its frame twisted by pressure. Above them, the roar of engines faded away. The carrier had stopped launching planes. Silence pressed down on the hull. Thick, heavy, final. Hope felt its weight. The realization that they were alone below decks, cut off from command and surrounded by the smell of salt, oil, and death. He thought about the men above who still believed the Yorktown could fight. Down here, the truth was clearer. The pumps were dead, the lights dimming, the air thick with steam hissing from broken pipes. The sea was eating its way in, inch by inch. Still, Hope didn't move toward the ladder. He stayed in the heat and smoke, counting his breaths, staring at the rising waterline. Something inside him refused to believe this was how the Yorktown would die. Not after Coral Sea, not after everything patched, welded, and risked to keep her alive. He clenched his fists, his skin blackened with soot, and stepped closer to the flood. The manuals were worthless, the systems dead, but somewhere in the chaos there had to be one last way to fight back. The hull groaned again, deeper and louder this time, like a wounded giant still refusing to fall. Hope crouched beside the hatch, lungs burning with diesel and steam, as the flood crept another inch up the ladder. The corridor throbbed with red emergency light, each pulse keeping rhythm with the moaning hull. Water lapped against his boots, warm, oily, carrying splinters of paint and strips of torn canvas. He wiped his eyes with a soot-blackened hand and stared at the lifeless pump panel. No vibration, no pressure. Only the hiss of broken lines and the steady, merciless pull of the sea. A fire bucket drifted past, bumping against his leg. Its rim clanged against the ladder before spinning slowly in the swirling current. Another followed, then a third, torn loose when a rack snapped from the wall. The ship carried hundreds of them along her passageways, cheap, dented, mostly forgotten by men who trusted switches and valves instead. Hope shoved one aside, cursing, and saw the water ripple from his push. Just a small disturbance, but enough to make him notice. A tiny shift, a dent in the rise. His mind, tuned for salvage since boyhood, locked onto the simplest truth. If something could be moved once, it could be moved again. He seized the bucket and filled it until it nearly overflowed. The weight dragged at his shoulders, the handle biting into his palms. With a hoarse grunt, he heaved it upward and hurled the contents through the hatch toward the higher deck. The water splashed, disappeared, replaced instantly by more dark liquid coiling around his knees. Useless, he thought, until he noticed the floodline hesitate, just for a breath, before continuing its climb. "Chain it," he muttered at first to no one. The word sounded absurd, a ghost from the age of wooden decks. Chain it. 2 sailors stumbled from the smoke, eyes bloodshot, uniforms dripping. Hope pointed, voice rough and ragged. "Buckets, helmets, anything that holds water. Form a line, up to the scupper." One hesitated, glancing toward the dead pumps. The other looked down the corridor as if expecting an officer to overrule him. There was no officer, only heat, steam, and the sound of the ship settling deeper. Regulations screamed against it. Manuals called hand bailing a desperate, outdated measure. Too slow, too dangerous, fit only for drills or tiny peacetime fires. Command would call it madness, a waste of manpower in action. He could already hear the charge in his mind, misuse of personnel during engagement. He pictured signatures, reprimands, careers ending quietly behind desks. Then the deck lurched, and a toolbox slid by like a coffin. The argument died there. He tore the whistle from around his neck and blew a single, piercing note. Shapes emerged from the haze, Cooks with burned aprons, a radio man gripping his headphones like a relic, a gunner's mate with blistered cheeks. Hope thrust buckets into their hands, forcing them into place, forcing doubt out of his own throat. "Line to the port ladder. Fast hands. Dump faster. Helmets if you're empty." His words struck like hammer blows, forging order out of chaos. The first run failed. A bucket slipped, smashing into a knee, its contents slapping back onto the deck with a hiss. The second try limped along, uncertain hands, ragged rhythm, men coughing through smoke. Hope pushed through them, resetting their stance, spacing them out along the slanted floor. "Short throws. Don't carry, just move it." He snatched a helmet from a hook, dipped it into the swirling black, the hot rim searing his knuckles, and flung the load toward the hatch. It disappeared into the glare. A petty officer forced through the line, shouting that the bridge hadn't approved this, that manpower was needed for patching, that the pumps would be back any moment. Hope didn't even glance at him. He simply pointed to the trembling flood line marking the rung, that thin black lip creeping higher. "Any minute," he said flatly. "We drown." The line steadied. Buckets began to fly, hand to hand, hand to air, air to hatch, where the sea swallowed what it had already claimed. The passageway filled with the clang of metal rims, the grunt of effort, the wet slap of spills. Oil smeared across faces until every man looked carved from tar. The list shoved them sideways. They leaned into it shoulder to shoulder. A cook tore his apron into strips to wrap his bleeding palms. The radio man counted under his breath. 6, 7, 8, 9, until the numbers became a rhythm. Hope held the center, his body anchoring the line, shifting men like ballast when the flow faltered. Every bucket bought a heartbeat. Every heartbeat delayed the sea. The smell of heated metal deepened, as though the hull itself were sweating. Somewhere above, a plane's fuel went up in a burst that rattled their teeth. Still, the chain held. He knew what would happen if the pumps came back. He'd step aside, let the machinery take over, and claim no glory for what bare hands had held back. He also knew what would happen if they didn't. He'd keep throwing until his arms gave out and the water covered him whole. Hope lifted another bucket. "Chain it," he said again. This time it sounded like the ship itself answering. Then he gave the only command that mattered. "We start now." The rhythm came slowly at first. Awkward, unsteady, like a heart struggling under strain. Buckets scraped the deck, splashed, collided midair. Men shouted over one another, their voices lost in the roar of water tearing through compartments. Hope moved along the line, adjusting their spacing, calling men by name instead of rank, using anger as the only thing stronger than fear. The chain began to move, rough, fast, unstoppable. The water kept rising, so they worked faster. Steam and oil thickened the air until each breath carried the taste of salt and iron. Above them, the carrier groaned beneath the weight of her wounds. Every vibration echoed through the floor, sending droplets raining down from the overhead like rhythmic drizzle. The emergency lights flickered, turning faces into pale, ghostly masks of exhaustion. The ship tilted again. A wrench rolled across the deck, brushed Hope's boot, and disappeared under the murky surface. He didn't look down. He could feel it, the angle deepening, 6 degrees, then 7. 1 more inch and the sea would claim her. Hope's hands were torn open, blisters peeled raw, skin burning. The bucket's handle cut deeper with every throw. He switched hands, ignored the pain, and shouted for pace. The men followed without hesitation now. No one mentioned pumps or orders anymore. There was only the chain. A galley helper collapsed face first into the flood, and 2 others yanked him back up before the next surge hit. None stopped to rest. Each man understood what hung in the air like heat. If even one link failed, the ship would go down. Somewhere aft, an explosion ripped through the hull. The shock threw the line into chaos. Buckets flew, men stumbled, water surged through the corridor in a crushing wave. Hope slammed against the bulkhead, breath gone, ears ringing. For a moment, everything turned white. Then forms came back into focus. Smoke poured from a vent, black and thick. He wiped his face with a trembling hand and barked, "Reset!" No pause. The line reformed, shorter, slower, but still alive. The rhythm returned. The sound shifted, from chaos to cadence. Buckets struck the deck in time. Water slapped metal in steady rhythm. Grunts and shouts became a beat, men moving like one body. One called the count, another echoed it. Hope watched the motion smooth out until it looked like the ship itself was breathing through them. The waterline stopped rising. For the first time, it seemed to hold still. Minutes blurred into each other. Sweat poured into eyes, stung open cuts, soaked their shirts until they clung to their skin. The air was a choking mix of vapor, oil, and blood. A sailor slipped near the front. Hope caught him by the collar and shoved him back into place. A lamp burst somewhere down the corridor, sparks scattering across the flood, lighting the black water with fleeting gold. Still they worked, passing, throwing, fighting the sea with their bare hands. Then the inclinometer needle, barely visible through the haze, quivered. It trembled, steadied, and began to tilt back. 1 degree, 2. The deck creaked but held. The men cheered once, short and sharp, before Hope raised a hand to silence them. "Keep it," he rasped. The list eased, the roll softened, and for the first time since the torpedo hit, Yorktown felt alive again. They worked on without knowing how long. An hour, maybe more. Hope's legs trembled, his muscles locking tight with each movement. He leaned against the bulkhead, dizzy from heat and fumes. The water had dropped, still dangerous, but no longer climbing. He looked toward the hatch, where faint sunlight flickered through the haze. Beyond it, the ocean stretched calm and endless, mocking the struggle inside. One sailor let his bucket fall and began to sob quietly, forehead pressed to the steel wall. Another placed a soot-blackened hand on his shoulder. No one said a word. Their movements slowed, then steadied again. Hope turned toward the corridor, eyes raw from smoke, and felt the faint shift beneath his feet. The balance changing, the ship's body breathing easier. Against every principle of damage control, against logic and metal, they had stopped the flood. The sea had been forced back, for now. But Hope knew it wouldn't last. The pumps were dead, the boilers cold. What they'd done was temporary, a fragile defiance against a relentless enemy. Still, when a gust of wind swept through the hatch and cooled his blistered face, one thought crossed his mind. For now, at least, the Yorktown still lived. When dawn filtered through the cracks in the smoke, the men of Yorktown looked like ghosts sculpted from rust and salt. Their eyes were swollen, their skin blistered by steam, uniforms stiff with dried oil. Still, the bucket line moved, slower now, but steady, each motion automatic, driven by exhaustion deeper than thought. The smell of diesel and sweat had fused into something metallic, almost sweet. Somewhere below, a low rumble began, the pumps coughing back to life, faint but unmistakable, like breath returning to a body long thought gone. Hope barely noticed at first. His world had narrowed to the swing of his arms, the pull of water, the flash of hands breaking through the haze. Only when a machinist's mate yelled, "Pressure holding," did he glance up. The gauges twitched. Auxiliary power was bleeding back into the system. It wasn't victory, but it meant survival still had a heartbeat. Hope gave a single nod, his expression unreadable. then told the men to keep working until the engineers took over. He didn't trust machines anymore, not after watching every one of them fail. By mid-morning, word of the bucket line had spread across the decks. Sailors crawling out of smoke-dark corridors whispered about Hope's chain, the men who fought the sea with their bare hands. Those who had fled returned, driven by guilt or rumor, carrying buckets, helmets, whatever could hold water. Gunners with destroyed stations joined beside cooks and radio operators. The boundaries between ranks and departments vanished in the heat. There were no officers, no divisions, only hands. One officer tried to halt it, shouting about procedure and discipline, but his voice was swallowed by the rhythm of sloshing buckets. The sound filled the ship like a drumbeat, echoing through steel walls, defiance made audible. When the captain heard reports of manual dewatering, he ordered it continued as long as results held. Hope never knew. He was too deep below, throat raw, shouting himself hoarse over the rising hum of pumps. When the first electric pump came back online, it didn't roar triumphantly. It hummed weakly, coughing bursts of water barely clearing the intake. Yet the sight of movement gave the men more energy than any rest could. They cheered once, ragged, brief, and returned to the chain. For every gallon the machines pulled, 3 more still left by hand. The steel was too slow. Flesh was faster. The compartments brightened as crews cut ventilation holes, letting smoke escape. Shafts of sunlight pierced the haze, glinting on the water until it gleamed gold. For a moment it looked peaceful, almost calm, until another deep groan rolled through the hull. The Yorktown was still bleeding from her seams, still fighting the drag of gravity. Hope knew the pumps alone couldn't keep up. Pressure in the port bilge was climbing again. He signaled for another line to form aft. The men obeyed instantly. Buckets clanged, splashed, passed in rhythm. The motion came faster now, desperate. Above them, an engineer reported to the bridge that flooding had stabilized. Captain Buckmaster turned to his officers, eyes hollow but shining with pride. "Tell them to hold," he said quietly. "Whatever they're doing, it's working." Below, Hope's voice was nearly gone. He rasped out orders, pointing when he couldn't speak, leading through motion alone. Every few minutes he checked the list. Still improving, fraction by fraction. His body trembled from heat and dehydration. His hands split to the bone, nails blackened by oil and grit. Still he passed buckets, each throw an act of defiance against the inevitable. When a sailor collapsed beside him, Hope dragged the man clear and took his place without pause. There was no stopping now. The chain was more than work. It had become conviction, a living organism of will holding back the sea, every movement synchronized, every heartbeat one. Hours later, the pumps roared fully alive. Engineers flooded the compartments with mechanical thunder, water retreating through pipes that rattled like bones. The chain slowed, then fell still. Silence followed, thick, unreal. Hope leaned against the bulkhead, chest heaving, listening to the hum of working machinery. They had done it. No one spoke. No cheers came. The men only watched the water lines sink, inch by inch, feeling the quiet tremor of survival move through the deck. Hope closed his eyes, pressed his forehead to the warm steel, and let the steady rhythm of the pumps wash over him like rain. Above them, the ship lifted herself another degree. The bucket chain had saved her, not through strength or orders, but through pure, unyielding refusal to die. The night after the attack was eerily still. The ocean around Yorktown shimmered faintly with spilled oil, a dark mirror catching the light of the stars. The carrier floated motionless, her decks twisted and scarred but still upright. Every man aboard could feel the exhaustion humming through the steel beneath their boots. She was alive, but only just, Engines silent, guns cold, power failing. Hope sat beside the hatch, his hands wrapped in torn strips of canvas, watching vapor drift from the flooded compartment. The pumps hummed steadily now, but he knew what that sound truly meant. The ship wasn't healing, only bleeding slower. By dawn, destroyers ringed her like sentinels. Tow cables were readied. Orders arrived to move Yorktown toward Midway for emergency repairs. The crew worked without speaking, their voices rasped raw from smoke and fatigue. Hope stood near the port rail as the horizon burned rose and gold. His bucket chain was gone, replaced by hoses and machinery, but the scent of oil and salt still hung heavy, a reminder of the battle that had saved her. For a moment he dared to think that maybe the sea would let her go. Then the horizon flared white. A lookout's cry tore through the quiet. "Torpedoes! Starboard side!" Hope's head snapped around. Far away, a white wake cut the surface like a whip. The submarine I-168 had found its mark. Before anyone could react, the first torpedo struck. Deep, brutal, final. The deck lifted under his feet, slamming him against a bulkhead. Heat surged through the corridor, filling the air with the stench of burning insulation. Another explosion followed, sharper, closer. The ship rolled hard to port, groaning like a wounded animal. Alarms howled, men rushed for their stations, some barefoot, others barely awake. The hull trembled again as a third torpedo hit home. Water crashed through ruptured seams, hammering bulkheads already torn from the previous day's fight. Hope staggered through the smoke toward the same compartment he'd once fought to save. The flood met him like an old adversary. Colder now, faster. Pumps sputtered once, coughed, then died. He shouted for men to reform the chain. There were fewer now, their faces pale under the soot, but they came. Buckets reappeared, grabbed from hooks and corners. The old rhythm began again, weaker, slower, but unbroken. The sea poured in through gaping holes, yet they battled it the same way. One bucket at a time, muscles trembling, teeth gritted. Hope's boots slipped on the tilting deck. He caught himself on a valve wheel, chest pounding. The water was already up to his thighs, thick with oil. Debris floated past. A wrench, a torn glove, a body no one dared reach for. The compartment groaned, plates bending inward. Overhead, metal screamed and snapped under the strain. Still, Hope shouted for rhythm. Then came the fourth impact, a strike deeper, crueler, right beneath the machinery spaces. The entire carrier convulsed. The lights burst out, plunging everything into darkness. Hope was hurled against the ladder, ribs cracking, lungs crushed by the blast. When he came to, the bucket line was gone. Men were scattered, some dragging the wounded, others silent. The sound of rushing water filled every space now, vast, merciless, unstoppable. "Abandon ship!" The order came through the intercom. Faint, final. Hope hesitated, staring at the swirling flood around his knees. Beneath the chaos, he could still feel the heartbeat of the Yorktown, faint but stubborn. Part of him wanted to stay, to fight until nothing was left to throw. But the list was too steep. The deck pitched and water surged upward, sweeping buckets away. He climbed the ladder, coughing through the smoke. The open air hit him like fire, hot wind, salt, smoke. Around him, men leapt into lifeboats or straight into the sea. The destroyer Hammond, lashed alongside to assist, had already vanished in its own explosion. The sky above was streaked with black columns of smoke, their tops glowing orange in the rising sun. Hope turned once more, staring down the length of the ship that had carried him through Coral Sea, through Midway, through hell and back. The deck was deserted now, rails twisted, planes torn to scraps. Flames climbed the island tower, their reflections rippling across the dark waves. Hope drew one last breath of the ship's air, burnt metallic, alive, and jumped. The sea swallowed him whole, dragging him into cold silence. When he surfaced, choking, Yorktown still floated behind him, bow high, stern, sinking slow, proud even as she died. She refused to go quickly. For 2 more days she would drift, battered and burning, before the ocean finally took her. Hope watched her settle into the deep and thought of the buckets, the hands, the rhythm that had kept her alive when reason said she shouldn't have survived. She had been saved once by sheer defiance, and even as she sank, she carried that spirit with her. By morning, the sea lay flat again, calm, indifferent, and cruel, as if nothing at all had happened. The smoke had drifted westward, leaving only the scent behind, oil, cordite, and salt, the final breath of a dying ship. Yorktown was gone. Where she had stood, the ocean was now just a dark patch scattered with lifeboats, wreckage, and men too drained to speak. The faint hiss of oil fires rose and faded with the wind. Hope floated among them, his vest slick with fuel, his eyes half closed against the glare. He could still feel the ship's pulse in his bones, though she was no longer there. Destroyers moved through the wreckage, their hulls carving slow, cautious paths. Sailors leaned over rails, pulling survivors from the sea, faces streaked with soot, eyes wide with disbelief. Hope was hauled aboard the USS Hughes, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't grip the ladder. A corpsman wrapped him in a blanket, but the warmth meant nothing. He sat on the deck, staring at his bandaged palms, skin stained black with oil that refused to wash away. Around him, men coughed up seawater, called for friends who didn't answer, and one by one fell silent. By nightfall, the sky cleared. The burning oil slick glowed faintly on the horizon, a drifting grave marker miles wide. From the bridge, Captain Buckmaster stared toward the edge of the world and said nothing. No one did. Reports soon came from Midway and the rest of the task force. The Japanese carriers were burning. 4 gone in a single day. The enemy's pride, its power, shattered. Historians would later call it the turning point of the Pacific War. But on the deck of the Hughes, surrounded by what was left of Yorktown, victory felt hollow. Hope heard the news from a radio man who spoke softly, almost like confession. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryū, all destroyed. Their loss crippled Japan's naval strength. But without Yorktown, none of it would have happened. Her dive bombers had crippled Soryu, her torpedoes had finished Hiryū. Even in flames, she had forced the enemy to divide its attack, buying the other carriers time to strike back. She had died doing her duty, holding the line so others could survive. The Navy called it a strategic sacrifice. Hope called it survival by inches. He thought of that night when they'd kept her afloat with buckets, of hands blistered and blackened with oil, of the sound of steel straining like a wounded creature that refused to die. Without those hours, without that chain, Yorktown would have rolled over long before dawn. The Japanese torpedo planes would have found no target, and the battle might have ended differently. Weeks later, Hope sat before a review board at Pearl Harbor. The room smelled faintly of ink and salt air. They asked about the manual dewatering action, his decision to ignore procedure, to act without orders. Hope's answer was simple, his voice dry and even. We didn't have power. We used what we had. The officers nodded, made notes, and dismissed him. No citation came. No medal followed. His name appeared only once in a maintenance report, buried among technical lines about hull damage and fire containment. But the story traveled on its own. Among sailors, word spread faster than any report. A man named Hope kept her afloat, they said, in mess halls, workshops, and gun bays across the Pacific. Some called it luck. Others called it sheer stubbornness. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that, when every system failed, human hands had not. Hope never sought recognition. He stayed with destroyers through the rest of the war, fixing what others broke, fighting what others began. Sometimes, when a ship listed under fire, he'd glance at a row of buckets and remember that night. The rhythm, the heat, the taste of salt in his teeth. But he never spoke of it aloud. Yorktown rested nearly 4 miles down, her hull upright, her decks eerily preserved. Divers who later reached her said it felt like time had stopped. Tools scattered across the floor, hatches half open, helmets resting beside valves still damp with rust. The sea had sealed her in silence. But what she carried wasn't lost. She had gone down, yes, but not before she changed the war above her. Years later, long after the war had burned itself out, a corroded bucket hung behind glass in a naval museum in Norfolk. Its handle was bent, the metal scarred by salt, and a faint, half-erased number still clung to its side. The small plaque below read, "Damage Control Equipment, USS Yorktown, CV-5, Midway, 1942. No medals, no names, no ceremony, just an artifact of endurance, dull, ordinary, and nearly invisible to the crowds passing by. Yet to those who had been there it was more than metal. It was defiance made solid. Children paused briefly before drifting toward the torpedoes and planes. Veterans lingered longer, eyes narrowing, memories stirring quietly behind the silence. Some recognized the curve of that handle, the bite it had left on flesh, the faint scorch around its rim. It wasn't simply a relic. It was a piece of a night when a carrier refused to die. Hope never came to see it. He left the Navy quietly, years before his hair turned gray, and settled near the coast. Close enough to hear the sea, far enough that he didn't have to see it. He lived simply, rarely mentioning Midway unless someone else did, and even then, only in passing. People spoke of him as a man who had seen too much and carried it gently, as if his memories were a weight he'd learned not to shift. When younger sailors asked about Yorktown, he would smile faintly and say, "She was tougher than any of us ever deserved." In later training manuals, his act survived without his name. The Navy's revised Damage Control Handbook added a single quiet line buried in Section 5. In total loss of power, manual bucket brigades may supplement or substitute for electric pumps when necessary. It sounded sterile, procedural, stripped of any trace of human effort. Yet those words carried the heartbeat of that night. Each sentence was built on blistered palms and scorched air. What had begun as one man's refusal to wait for orders had become doctrine. By the 1950s, new carriers bore the imprint of Yorktown's lesson. Compartments were rebuilt for manual access, auxiliary pumps multiplied, and emergency drills included the bucket relay as a last resort. Few instructors knew where it came from. They treated it as theory, not memory. Yet somewhere in the stillness of those steel decks, the echo of that first chain endured. The splash of water, the rhythm of effort, the steady defiance of men battling the sea with their hands. The Yorktown herself remained on the ocean floor, upright and hauntingly preserved. When divers reached her decades later, they found her ghost-like, wrapped in silt and silence. The compartments told their story without words. A wrench resting in a corner, an overturned pail against a bulkhead, the faint imprint of a hand baked into paint by heat and time. Cameras recorded what eyes could barely take in, the stubbornness of survival etched into metal. When historians wrote about Midway, they spoke of admirals, squadrons, and tactics, of torpedoes and timing. But the real truth of that battle lived smaller, in the spaces between orders, in the unseen moments when no one was watching, when sailors built miracles out of desperation. Hope's chain of buckets never appeared in any report, yet its legacy lived in every ship that followed. In the twilight of his life, Hope sat on his porch overlooking the gray Atlantic. The air smelled of rain and kelp. He listened to the waves breaking on the rocks, steady and endless. In that rhythm, he could still hear it. Buckets scraping, men shouting, steel bending but holding firm. The sea always took ships. That was its nature. But sometimes, for reasons it never explained, it gave one back, if only for a night. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, the wind carrying salt across his face. Somewhere beyond the horizon, 4 miles down, Yorktown still stood watch in the dark. Her decks silent, her scars sealed by time, and somewhere within that silence a single rusted bucket waited, a symbol of how far human courage can reach when logic ends.